Imagine waking up in a room the size of a closet. Three bunks stacked so close together that sitting upright means brushing the ceiling with your forehead, surrounded by 4,800 other people who haven't seen land in 63 days and won't for another 47, somewhere in the middle of an ocean that no civilian ship will enter, with no grocery store within 1,000 miles, no hospital within reach, no way to call home, no way to order anything, no supply truck arriving at dawn. And the only thing standing between order and collapse is a system so precisely engineered that it processes, stores, prepares, and delivers roughly 18,000 individual meals every single day without interruption. And here is the question that the designers of this system had to answer before a single bolt was welded into place. What happens to 5,000 human beings when the food system fails at sea? That question is not hypothetical. It has been studied, stress-tested, rehearsed, and built into every corridor of every nuclear-powered aircraft carrier the United States Navy operates. And the answer is not a plan. It is an architecture, a living mechanical civilization hidden beneath the flight deck that most people will never see, designed around one unavoidable constraint. There is no outside world to call for help. A Nimitz-class or Gerald R. Ford-class aircraft carrier displaces over 100,000 tons of steel, stretches more than 1,000 feet from bow to stern, and carries a crew that rivals the population of a small town. But the comparison to a town ends the moment you understand what a town relies on without thinking. Supply chains, municipal water systems, commercial food networks, refrigerated trucking, pharmaceutical distribution, waste management infrastructure, and the invisible assumption that if something runs out, a replacement is 20 minutes away. On a carrier operating in restricted waters under emissions control, that assumption is not just wrong. It is a threat to mission readiness, and so the entire vessel is engineered not as a warship that happens to feed people, but as a fully self-sustaining food logistics organism that happens to carry aircraft. This is where civilian logic collapses entirely. In civilian food service, the answer to a supply problem is a phone call. On a carrier 600 miles from the nearest port, the answer to a supply problem had to be designed out of existence before departure, and understanding how that was done requires starting not with the food itself, but with the space where food lives. Because space on a warship is not allocated, it is rationed. And every cubic foot of refrigerated storage represents a calculation about human performance, caloric need, mission length, and the cost of failure. The carrier's food storage system is divided into multiple segregated refrigerated and frozen compartments located deep within the hull in areas deliberately chosen for structural stability and proximity to the ship's chilled water systems. And these spaces hold between 150,000 and 200,000 pounds of food at any given point in a standard deployment. A number that sounds large until you divide it by 5,000 people and 30 days, and realize that the margin between abundance and rationing is measured not in weeks, but in careful daily throughput management, executed by a team of culinary specialists who track consumption with the same precision that a logistics officer tracks fuel. But this creates a new vulnerability that most people never consider. Cold storage is not passive. It requires continuous power, continuous refrigerant circulation, continuous monitoring, and the moment the chilled water loop serving a compartment loses pressure or a compressor fails, the clock starts. Not dramatically, not with alarms going off across the ship, but silently, in the temperature sensors that culinary specialists check on rotation. Because a 10-degree rise in a 38,000-pound beef compartment doesn't announce itself, it accumulates. And if it goes undetected for 8 hours during a busy flight operations period, the loss is not just food, it is a cascading readiness problem that forces accelerated consumption of dry goods, compresses the deployment timeline, and forces a supply request that reveals position in restricted waters. This is why the food logistics system on a carrier is not staffed by cooks. It is staffed by specialists trained in food safety science, inventory rotation discipline, cold chain management, and rapid substitution protocol because the person managing that refrigerated beef compartment is not making dinner. They are managing a strategic resource under conditions that would shut down any civilian food distribution warehouse within hours. If you were standing in one of those storage compartments right now, you would not feel like you were on a ship at all. The hum of the refrigeration units, the systematic organization of sealed containers on tracked shelving, the temperature logs clipped to the bulkhead, the rotation schedule posted at eye level. It would feel like the back room of a warehouse, except that the floor is moving beneath you at a rate you cannot detect without instruments, and somewhere above you, aircraft are landing on a moving runway at 150 miles per hour, and the 4,800 people you're feeding have not slept a full night in 2 weeks. The caloric requirement for a carrier crew is not calculated like a civilian meal plan. It is calculated around shift structure, physical labor intensity, climate-controlled versus open-deck exposure, and the documented metabolic demands of sustained high-stress operational work, which means that the average sailor on an active deployment burns between 3,200 and 4,000 calories per day, and the flight deck crew, working in wind and noise and physically demanding conditions for 10-hour shifts, can exceed that significantly. And the culinary specialists know this because the Navy's nutritional standards are embedded into the menu planning system itself, not as a preference, but as a performance requirement, because a crew that is underfueled makes errors, and errors on a carrier do not result in a bad quarterly review. They result in aircraft mishaps, mechanical failures, and the kind of chain reactions that end careers in investigations. This is where the pressure intensifies. The menu planning system on a carrier is not a civilian catering menu. It is a rotating cycle typically built around a 28-day calendar that is calibrated to prevent flavor fatigue, which is the documented psychological phenomenon where repetition in a confined, high-stress environment causes food to become a source of resentment rather than recovery. And if you think flavor fatigue sounds like a soft concern relative to the operational demands of carrier aviation, consider that the historical record of long-duration naval deployments is filled with documented morale collapses that trace directly to food monotony, and consider that a morale collapse on a vessel where 4,800 people share the same walls, the same corridors, the same noise, and the same inability to leave produces a psychological pressure gradient that commanders have to manage as actively as they manage fuel consumption. The 28-day menu cycle is therefore not a comfort measure. It is a psychological stability protocol, and it is built around a supply chain that was frozen into the ship's provisions list weeks before departure, which means that every substitution forced by a spoiled compartment, an unexpected surge in consumption, or a delayed resupply is a deviation from a plan that was already operating at minimum margin. And here is what most people never consider about that resupply. It does not work the way a grocery delivery works. When a carrier receives a replenishment at sea, it does so while underway. From a fast combat support ship or replenishment oiler that pulls alongside at a distance of roughly 200 feet, traveling at the same speed, connected to the carrier by tensioned highlines and fuel hoses, while both ships are moving through open ocean at 12 knots, and the personnel who transfer provisions across those highlines are doing so in weather conditions that range from calm to genuinely dangerous in daylight or darkness, depending on operational schedule, and the window for that transfer is not open-ended. It closes the moment operational priorities shift, and if the carrier is called away before the full provisions list is transferred, whatever was not received stays on the replenishment ship, and the menu planning team absorbs the shortfall and rebuilds the rotation around what remains. And they do this without communicating the specific nature of the shortfall outside of internal channels, because the contents of a carrier's provisions can reveal information about deployment duration and operational posture. If resupply didn't arrive on schedule, the culinary specialists would already know before the official notification, because their inventory tracking system operates on consumption rate projections that calculate a daily depletion model for every major food category, and the moment the projected depletion curve for any critical category intersects with the provisioning reserve threshold, a buffer the Navy builds into every deployment plan, the system flags it, not as an emergency, but as a planning trigger, which is the moment the menu cycle begins its invisible compression. Substituting higher-calorie dry goods for refrigerated proteins, extending the cycle days for perishable items, and introducing what the culinary team calls bridge meals, meals designed to maintain caloric density and psychological satisfaction while reducing dependence on the categories under pressure. What the crew sees is a slightly different menu. What is actually happening is a controlled logistics adjustment executed by people who have trained for exactly this scenario and who understand that the difference between a managed shortage and a visible one is the difference between sustained morale and the kind of ambient anxiety that spreads through a confined crew the way sound spreads through metal. The water system is inseparable from the food system. And this is where the engineering becomes almost incomprehensible in its self-sufficiency. A Nimitz-class carrier generates its own fresh water from seawater using a distillation process powered by the steam generated by its 2 nuclear reactors, producing up to 400,000 gallons of fresh water per day, a quantity that exceeds the daily water consumption of many small American cities. And this is not a backup system. It is the primary system. And it has been the primary system since the introduction of nuclear propulsion, because the nuclear plant's ability to generate effectively unlimited steam made water independence not just possible, but inevitable. And the engineers who designed that integration understood something that civilian infrastructure planners never have to confront. The worst possible failure mode is the one that cascades silently through every other system before anyone realizes the primary system has failed. Fresh water on a carrier feeds the food preparation system, the medical system, the firefighting system, the personnel hygiene system, and the cooling loops for electronics that would otherwise overheat within hours in a sealed metal hull. If the distillation plants went offline, and they have in training exercises and in real operational incidents, the carrier shifts immediately to stored reserve water, a supply calculated to sustain minimum operations for a defined number of hours while the distillation plant is restored. And during that window, the culinary team does not wait for orders, because their protocol for water conservation is embedded in their standard procedures and activates automatically. Dry goods replace water-intensive food preparation. Food service volume is reduced and consolidated into fewer service periods, and the water consumption per meal drops to its engineered minimum without requiring any announcement to the crew. This is the design philosophy that governs every system on the ship. Failure is not treated as an exception. It is treated as an expected state that the system must survive without external assistance. And so every critical system has not just a backup, but a behavioral protocol that activates before the backup is fully engaged. Buying time in the gap between failure and restoration, that is always where the real danger lives. The waste management system tells the same story from the opposite direction, and it is a story that most people never think about because waste is the invisible half of a logistics system that only becomes visible when it fails. A crew of 4,800 people consuming 18,000 meals per day generates an extraordinary volume of organic waste, food packaging, gray water, and biological material, and in a vessel operating under strict environmental compliance rules that prohibit unprocessed waste discharge in most international waters, every cubic foot of that waste has to be processed, stored, reduced, or converted into a form that can be legally discharged or transferred to a receiving facility at port. And the systems that handle this are not afterthoughts. They are engineered into the hull with the same rigor as the propulsion system, because a carrier whose waste management system fails is a carrier whose food service system must eventually shut down, whose crew hygiene degrades, and whose operational capacity drops in a way that cannot be concealed from commanders or crews. The medical system sits at the intersection of all of these logistics streams in a way that most people don't anticipate. The carrier's medical facility, designated a Level 1 trauma center at sea, exists not just to treat injuries, but to monitor the systemic health of the crew in response to the food and water the culinary system provides, and the medical staff tracks nutritional trends, hydration metrics, and stress-related health indicators across a population of 4,800 people in a way that no civilian hospital would ever need to, because in a civilian hospital, a patient with a nutritional deficiency can be sent home and told to eat differently. On a carrier, every person exhibiting a nutritional stress indicator is a person whose performance gap must be closed within the ship's resources using the food system that may already be operating under compression. The psychological dimension of food logistics is where the system reveals its deepest engineering, and it is the dimension least visible from the outside. Food is not merely fuel on a deployment, it is the primary discretionary experience available to a crew that has surrendered nearly every other form of personal autonomy to the operational requirements of the vessel. The timing of meals, the quality of food, the variety of options, the physical experience of the mess hall, these are not peripheral concerns, they are the daily anchors that structure time in an environment where time otherwise has no natural rhythm because the ship operates on rotating watch schedules that mean at any given moment, roughly a third of the crew is working, a third is sleeping, and a third is in the intermediate state that experienced sailors call the in-between, and the mess halls run continuously across 4 service periods to accommodate this reality, which means that the food logistics system is not planning 3 meals a day. It is planning a continuous 24-hour food production operation that must sustain peak quality at 0-100 for the night watch crew with the same fidelity it sustains at 1200 for the day watch crew. Because the sailor who comes off a 6-hour maintenance shift at 0300 and finds the food service at minimum quality is a sailor whose next shift will begin with a baseline of resentment that compounds across weeks and months. If you lived on this ship for 90 days, the thing you would understand that no briefing document captures is that the quality of the food system is not a hospitality metric. It is a command metric, and commanding officers track it with the same attention they track aircraft readiness rates, because the correlation between sustained food quality and crew cohesion is documented across decades of Navy deployment history in a record that leaves no room for the argument that it is secondary. The aircraft carrier is often described as the most powerful warship ever built, and that description is accurate but incomplete, because the warship is only the surface. Beneath the flight deck, and behind the aircraft elevators, and inside the corridors that the flight deck crew never visits, is a civilization that has solved, with engineering rather than luck, every problem that isolation at sea imposes on human survival, and food is not the beginning and end of that civilization's complexity. There are systems below the food system: power generation, propulsion management, internal communications infrastructure, nuclear plant monitoring, that the food system depends on and that most people will never know exist, and there is one system in particular operating in the lowest accessible spaces of the hull. That makes every other system possible, and that has never failed in a way that was fully recoverable without the intervention of people who train for exactly that failure every single day, and understanding what that system is and what it demands of the people responsible for it changes the way you understand what it means to build a machine designed to survive without the world.